What is Expressionism? This question was posed as much in the early 1900s as it is today. Poet Walter Reiner wrote, "Expressionism is not merely a question of technique or form, but above all a spiritual attitude that has not appeared in human history overnight, but dates back thousands of years." Question or not, the theme was posed because in 1912, the real inquiry was, what was Germany? Stricken by the First World War, many Germans felt their national identity stripped. The arts, and therefore the movies, became not only an escape, but also a quest into the mind and its anxieties. Peter Perret states in German Expressionism, Art and Society, that making the inner world of the artist visible and giving it central significance not only sifted the task of the image, but also affected the relationship between the artist and the public. In 1915, Adolf Benn found that most critics who wrote of the German artistic movements of the day lacked the understanding that Expressionism was German in its innermost essence. Benn said, "Expressionism brings a strengthening of the national element in art since it is built on will and fantasy." And from Caligari to Hitler, Siegfried Kracauer wrote that the introvert tendency traced to powerful collective desires. As he puts it, the German population, namely the middle class, seemed to have shut themselves off from the world, a world that was in their minds dictated by the Allied powers following the war and plagued by crippling inflation and internal struggle. As Krakauer points out, they acted as if under the influence of a terrific shock, which upset normal relations between their inner existence. On the surface, they lived on as before. Psychologically, they withdrew within themselves. The middle class and its affection for this type of movie was always the drive for Expressionist filmmaking, as Thomas Elsässer remarks in Expressionist film New Perspectives. Elsässer points out that the movement was more attempts by the artistic community to capture the concept of Autorenfilm, or auteur films, which struggled to find legitimization from 1913. This idea is an evolution of the Gothic or Romantic novel in the 19th century, which would later find its way on screen and become many of the influential movies of the period. It is reasonable to argue that German Expressionist cinema is a development of German Romanticism, Lottie Eisner wrote in The Haunted Screen, and that the modern technique merely lends a visible form to romantic fancies. As Elsässer puts it, Germany, it seems, periodically experiences a revival of romantic art and fantastic literature after every revolution that failed. This revival, in Elsässer's words, come from a frustrated desire to change, rather than a resistance to change, with the Faust or Prometheus figures, doubles of E.T.A. Hoffmann, and artist magicians with golems and homunculi, emerging like gods from above in the revival's wake. All of these elements would find their way into the movies. As Elsässer would later write in Expressionism in the Cinema, a particular style may also serve as a convenient visual shorthand to tie together disparate elements of story, character, and setting. The Faustian myth would find its way onto the screen in 1926 by F.W. Murnau. The golem would appear multiple times, most notable in 1920 with the performance by Paul Wegener, who would also shepherd in the doubles concept with his film The Student of Prague in 1913. But most explorations of Expressionism start with The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which was released in 1920, bringing into the mainstream what most would associate as the Expressionist style. Ironically, the stylization came about due to financial reasons. As Elsässer points out, it was a consequence of economic conditions and a lack of technical infrastructure that led to Hermann Worm, with some suggestions by Walter Reimann to make the images visionary, nightmarish. This dialogue between aesthetic choices and the demands of financial restraint speaks as much to stop-motion animation as it did to Robert Wiene and the designers of Dr. Caligari. As Ken A. Priebe remarked in The Advanced Art of Stop-Motion Animation, for the most well-executed stop-motion sequences, such as Ray Harryhausen's 5-minute skeleton fight in 1963's Jason and the Argonauts, the shorter format provided a solid frame to place as much quality as possible. Often there was not enough time or budget to create the same amount of animation for more than what any feature film required, so all available resources were applied to creating these short moments of beautiful entertainment. This idea of conforming to the resources at hand is deeply embedded in Expressionist filmmaking. Elsässer mentions in Expressionism in the Cinema that many different styles and genres of Weimar cinema responded to different audiences, asking that might it be possible to think of Expressionism not as a style at all, but as an idiom that adapts itself to the respective conditions and reception. One that interposes itself, interprets or mediates between industry, its products, and the expectation of specific segments of consumers. Stop motion found itself responding to what audience wanted as well. As Pree points out, feature-length projects are just inherently more expensive, and because of that, they followed the demand of the audience. So while stop motion was finding its way into the movies as early as 1930, with Russian filmmaker and entomologist Ladislas Starwich's The Tale of the Fox, the more popular and more successful fare was 1937's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which, unlike The Tale of the Fox, did not suffer from several years of delays due to technical problems with the soundtrack and just the sheer act of having to craft as many as 75 individual puppets and shoot scenes that would take up to 273,000 individual movements to complete. As Snow White took the world by storm in 1937, The Tale of the Fox trickled out into Germany. At this point, Dr. Caligari, Faust, and even Fritz Lang's Metropolis had found its way onto the screen, but Germany would return to romanticism again with a stop-motion adaptation of a Brothers Grimm fairy tale, The Seven Ravens. This kinship between German expressionism and stop-motion animation aesthetically would become apparent modernly with The Nightmare Before Christmas, The Corpse Bride, or James and the Giant Peach, which use expressionism's jagged walls, slanted doors, and shadowed lighting to portray the psychological struggle and interior strife of its characters. But it would be executed more successfully in the works of Laika Studios, whose first three features, Coraline, Paranorman, and the Box Trolls, would share the aesthetic similarities, but also would explore the psychological and metaphysical fields that most of the masterpieces of the movement perfected. For Baldwin, being Prague's finest swordsman and wildest student is not nearly fulfilling enough if he can't gain the heart of the beautiful Countess Margit Schwarzenberg. But in order to do that, he'll need some money. Coincidentally, a mystical old man, Scapinelli, has presented Baldwin with an offer that could solve his conundrum. Baldwin can have 100,000 pieces of gold as long as the old man can take any item of his choosing from the student's room. Naturally, Baldwin agrees, and the transaction is set. Next, Paul Wegener, playing the role of the student and the film's director alongside Stellan Rye, sets in motion one of the earliest examples of a German expressionist hallmark, the doppelganger. To Baldwin's horror, Scapinelli summons a shadow of the student from his mirror, a phantom sharing every likeness with the naive young man. He earned his inheritance, but he would be haunted by his soul. For Coraline Jones, her looking glass appears in the shape of a small door and purple reflecting tunnel, delivering her into her spectral space as a reprieve from the suffocation of boredom and loneliness that has overtaken her in this new home her parents brought her to. Neither her mother nor father understand, but her other mother and other father do. Greeting her on the other side, the second world is everything Coraline could dream of: food, fun, and most importantly, attention. As Vivian Mueller puts it, Coraline has reached a threshold moment in the development of subjectivity, one where if there is no affirmation of self in the symbolic order, she runs the risk of retreating to a more regressive state, trapped in the mirror phase which allows only the play of the imaginary. Mueller expands on the point, saying that Coraline's decision to go through the tiny door beyond signifies as an expression of unconscious desire. To Mueller, Coraline's fragile and formative sense of self is directly connected to her mother and father, making her perfected other mother and father all the more appealing. In one way, Coraline's journey into the other world could carry the same characterization that Krakauer made German people of the Weimar period: their retreat into a shell. Reality was unsatisfactory for Coraline, and her shell was this other place, this fantasy that allowed her to gain the recognition, the attention, and the good she desired. For Krakauer, the epitome of this retreat was in the film most synonymous with the Expressionist movement, 1920's The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. As Dietrich Schoenemann describes the character of Caligari, he is a showman who asks for permission to exhibit a somnambulist on the fairground. That, coupled with his overall demeanor, his garb, and the act to which he is presenting, inserts an air of mystery and black magic around this character, much as the curated world of the other mother is presented to Coraline, a character who is at once enthralled with the prospects of this new land, but also skeptical of its longevity. Like Caligari, the other mother shifts from showman to terror, or as Mueller puts it, the salacious and nurturing mother, and threatening and fearsome crone. Both, she notes, are aspects in which Coraline sees her actual mother. The other mother, as both nurturer and crone, feels close to the character of Maria in Fritz Lang's 1927 film Metropolis, a doppelganger different from the previous two examples, as modernity and technology were the culprit of her rise rather than some ethereal force. As Julie Dover puts it, technologies of human imitation are laden both with the celebration of human potential and its darker side. Where we meet the other mother as this Norman Rockwell-esque caricature, we meet Maria as this embodiment of the Virgin Mary, pure and giving. When distorted, the two become beasts, Maria thrusting and contorting, spinning a web of anxiety and lies to incite fear, while the other mother takes a more literal approach to the spinning webs, with metal needle hands feeling akin to the sacrifice of Maria's creator, Rotwang. Back to The Student of Prague, it is almost serendipitous that Stellan Rai would co-direct the film with Paul Wegener. As Bariah Rashidi described, the co-director wrote a doppelganger story in 1905 where a traveler happened upon a wax figure that shared his likeness, not so far from Coraline's happening upon a doll sharing the same qualities as herself. As the tale went, then I look at the doll's face and my breathing suddenly stops, as though it had hit a wall inside me. It is myself who stands there. The doll, the wax figure, it is myself. It is my features, my eyes, my frame, my haircut. And as it stands there with the thumb and first finger of the left hand in the waistcoat pocket, with the coat collar turned up and a mocking smile around the slightly crooked left side of the mouth, it is me, completely, so lifelike in the dead wax. Only the eyes are somehow smaller than mine. In his writing on the uncanny, Sigmund Freud said that the loss of the eyes is the biggest contributing factor to making the story feel uncanny, as the eyes are tied to one's identity. For Coraline, the loss of eyes is changed to a substitution of buttons in their place. The psychological influence on the audience can be felt in Coraline through its set design. Concept artist Tadahiro Usugi remarked that he drew the designs for the film with influences from graphic design of the 1950s and 60s, but the work also speaks to an expressionistic influence, especially on the exterior of Coraline's house and the layout of the other mother's space in Final Confrontation. Lottie Eisner shares a point with Rudolf Kurtz on the design of Caligari, saying the curving and slanting lines of the set are decidedly metaphysical, and are there to cause a reaction from their viewer who will feel differently when confronted with slanted, jagged lines compared to straight ones. As Eisner adds, with Caligari, what matters is to create states of anxiety and terror, with the house and walls of the set vibrating with extraordinary spirituality. While Coraline doesn't share the opening normal world that Caligari installed before concluding with the distorted curtain-pulling plot twist of the entire narrative taking place in the mind of an asylum patient, expressionistic influences are present even in the normal world for Coraline, making the transition back from the other world to the normal world less of a return from expressionism to naturalism and more in line with how Caligari was originally intended to end by screenwriters Hans Janowitz and Karl Mayer, where instead of bracketing the story with qualifiers of insanity, it would devolve into the protagonist's admission into the asylum to bring an end to the investigation. But more importantly, it wouldn't show a difference in design between the two worlds. For Coraline, there is no distinction between expressionism and naturalism, which is probably due to its being stop motion. Expressionism, in a sense, is almost a naturalism of stop motion, and this allows the anxieties and psychological toils of the narrative to play out in a more genuine and effective way. The other German examples given don't resolve themselves like the Neil Gaiman tale. In The Student of Prague, Baldwin fires a gun at his double, assuming that the fatal wound will dispel his fear, but ends up being his own undoing. As Krakauer puts it, Baldwin is not part of the world is contained in Baldwin. And for Metropolis, the modern monster is defeated, misconceived and burnt at the stake in an almost reverse Joan of Arc, with the crowd discovering their ignorance and mistakes soon after the flames engulf the mechanical trickster. Coraline shares similar features with each film. Like The Student of Prague, she bests her doppelganger, and like Metropolis, a ceremony leads to a finite conclusion to the terror. Even a bit of Caligari comes in play, as her parents brush off her fantastical retellings of her quest to revive them and move on to the celebration of the sale of their latest catalog. The adventure was nothing more than the creative thinking of a curious young girl. The Box Trolls, the third Laika feature film, opens with a scream into the night, as a small beast makes off with a creature, scurrying into the darkness and the unknown. For the German films of the 1920s, the street was, as Lottie Eisner referred to it, a call of destiny. It is the lure and enticement of all poor devils who, tired of their dull houses and monotonous lives, are out for adventure and escape. In a way, the Straßenfilm, or the street film, as it was referred to as, became almost as synonymous with what we associate with German Expressionism as much as the jagged walls of Caligari's mental hospital. As Eisner would say, Expressionism was to be used not just for effects proposed by the real object as it presents itself to the physical eye, but also for effects needing to be experience intellectually. One effective tactic of the movement was presenting realism in a fantastical sense, a trait that can be found in all three Laika features. The towing of a line between real and surreal was paramount for the Street film. In 1920s, aptly named The Street, one of our protagonists, a man fed up with the monotony of his day-to-day life, who escapes into the streets to find excitement, is consistently confronted with reality and dream. As Krakauer explains it, the man moves about like a somnambulist, again evoking a central character in Caligari, and adds that his gestures seem to be determined by hallucinations rather than by actual experiences. For Krakauer and even to the average viewer, this unrealistic animation of the body spoils the expressionistic origins of the narrative. He goes a bit further, attributing the course of the movie, where the man falls deeper and deeper into an underbelly that he can't contend with, ending with a suicide attempt and the eventual reconciliation with his wife at home, to the previously mentioned concept of the German people's retreat into a shell. Rebellion to submission is another consistency in the Street film. For the Street, it is epitomized in the film's final shot, a lingering gaze at the man as he returns home and is held by his wife, who looks out at the window, unaware of her husband's misdeeds, but fully aware of the dark capabilities that the streets supply. For Eggs, the protagonist of the Box Trolls, he is more aware of the dangers of the street in the same way as the wife. It is an unforgiving place. But more obviously, the Box Trolls, which follows Eggs, as he tries to uncover the abduction of the creatures known as the Box Trolls that took him in as a child, it feels more akin to From Morn to Midnight, or even The Last Laugh, engaging with the discrepancy in class between the protagonist and the other characters, and how stature dictates the gravity of a voice. Similar to the monotony-fighting main character of The Street, From Morn to Midnight finds its protagonist, a bank cashier, becoming run down with the day-to-day tedium of his job, leading him to make off with a large sum of money and join the city lights and glamour of the nearby metropolis. Like From Morn to Midnight, the Box Trolls engages not only with fascination for the glamour of upper-class living, but also the ease and security that it brings. In both films, the main characters find power in the slightest status symbols and what they can mean for someone trying to climb higher in the social sphere. While both come crashing down, Eggs at least understands the shallowness of the entire system, while the cashier just meets his doom. Recognition and honor is not so easily won, and no one understands that more in the Box Trolls than Snatcher, the film's villain. Making a deal with the town's dignitary to eradicate the Box Troll infestation following the alleged abduction of a child, Snatcher's ultimate goal is to exchange the ruby red hat that sits atop his head for the pearl white symbol of influence that Lord Portly Rind wears as he shakes on the deal. Much like the protagonist of F.W. Murnau's 1924 film, The Last Laugh, clothing or exuberant accessories accentuate the status of class and importance. For the aging doorman, his white hat is his prestigious job holding the doors at a regal hotel. In one of the first instances where we see the influence of his garb, the doorman makes his way home to much fanfare and admiration of his neighbors and family. Much like Snatcher's dependence on Portly Rind and his word to ascend the social ladder, Krakauer sees the stripping of the uniform from the doorman in The Last Laugh as an implication that authority, and authority alone, fuses the disparate social spheres into a whole, with the fall of the uniform representing that authority is bound to provoke anarchy. This anarchy comes in the form of the doorman's neighbors who readily reject him after his demotion for what Krakauer describes as being socially abandoned and thrown back into the gloominess of their flats and of their souls. Snatcher takes a more Hollywood approach and attacks the town in retaliation against Portly Rind and specifically Eggs for keeping him from his overall goal. And while it lacks the poignancy of The Last Laugh's first ending, with the doorman, now relegated to work in the washroom, slumped over and with another worker putting a cloak over him, in what Krakauer describes as a moving gesture of solidarity between two human wrecks. A gesture, though, that does not alter anything. It does show that Snatcher is too far gone by the movie's end to find any sort of redemption.
Don't do it. It won't change who you are. Jeez, hats, boxes. They don't make you. You make you.
I have made me, boy. This is my destiny.
The final bite is a fatal blow, and once again, the street's call of destiny claims another life. The awakening of the Golem is quick and almost violent, as Paul Wegener's eyes dart to life with his clay-clad body. The first meeting of Count Orlok occurs when the Count emerges from the shadows, arms elevated in a state to evoke your innermost dread. Norman watches as a green arm emerges from the ground, pounding through the gravel and rising with primordial fury. Each entrance of the undead creature is aggressive, even berserk. These characters aren't introducing themselves, but announcing their presence. As Alcesser states, the fantastic manifests itself as fantastic, not as reference, but as discourse. These creatures were not entering the world to just enact destruction for pleasure, but to challenge its inhabitants against taboos and rituals. For both the Golem, how he came into this world, and Nosferatu, their monsters signified societal anxiety through fantastical realism. Krakauer finds the Golem character, and to an extent its cousin in Homunculus, to be allegories for a German people depressed with their post-war lack of progress. As the English and French moved forward in revolution, the Germans were stuck in political immaturity, which caused an insecure social condition. Nosferatu further signified that hate-love condition within the people. Krakauer saw the character as a scourged god, who was a bloodthirsty, blood-sucking tyrant figure, with the idea that great love might force tyranny and retreat. The idea is of great relevance to Paranorman, the second feature film from Laika, which, much like the Golem and Nosferatu, features an invasion of undead creatures that causes mass panic in the town. At this point, Norman is seen as an outcast. Disavowed by his family and ignored by his peers, his gift of talking to the undead makes him an immediate pariah, but it becomes his destiny to rid the town of the witch's curse, a task passed down to those with his idolic gift for generations. Not making it in time, the witch is unleashed, and with it, a group of zombies. Emerging from the ground with a vengeful intent seared into their soulless eyes, Paranorman lives up to Krakauer's assessment of Nosferatu and the idea that great love might force tyranny and retreat, as the witch terrorizing the town carries this otherworldly hold over its inhabitants, much like Nosferatu and the Golem do to their respective towns whenever their fury is unleashed. In all three films, chaos is brought about less by the actual creature and more by the hysteria that the terrified population concoct. Murnau has empty streets in Nosferatu, as the crowds have either been killed off or run away, while an angry crowd, much like in Paranorman, chases the Golem until his fateful interaction with the young girl. The hysterical crowd is no stranger to the expressionist film. One great example is the finale to Metropolis, which features a crowd infected by the misguidings of a false prophet, tearing down the industry that gives the city life, and then turning their rage toward who they assume to be the prophet, causing confusion, chaos, and ultimately the burning at the stake of the robotic liar. Krakauer sees Metropolis as a youth film, which features young characters turning against authority and adult tyrants. But even more, he sees Metropolis as a youth film merging with the street film. By stigmatizing them and simultaneously holding out the prospect of their interchange, the youth films assume the function of the street films. They express discontent with the regime and forecast its decomposition. Second, the repudiation of absolute authority means just that and nothing more. But the youth films have the character of dreams, and in dreams, opposition to an attitude is often tantamount to its acceptance. Metropolis ends with what Krakauer describes as a sham alliance. All through the film, we hear the sentiment that the heart mediates between the brain and the head, which is personified in the shaking of hands between the labor leader and the main character's father, the industrialist, with the help of our protagonist to guide their hands together. This rings false, as Krakauer points out the industrialist has outwitted his son. The concession he makes amounts to a policy of appeasement that not only prevents the workers from winning their cause, but enables him to tighten his grip on them. His robot stratagem was a blunder in as much as it rested upon insufficient knowledge of the mentality of the masses. Paranorman seems to reach its conclusion in much the same way. Norman can sympathize with the anger and resentment the witch, who we learn is an 11-year-old girl named Agatha with the same gift as Norman, has toward the people that wronged her. But her scorn won't bring back what she wants most, her mother, or resolve her death.
Look like any of them are trying to hurt you? They're just people. Well, at least they used to be, just stupid people who should have known better. They did something unforgivable because they were scared and they were cursed for it.
What about the people who hurt you? Don't you ever want to make them suffer?
Well, yeah, but what good would that do?
Much like the Golem, Nosferatu, and Metropolis, fear and a lack of knowledge leads to drastic and sometimes fatal actions outside of the realm of what you'd expect from people. But even more so than Metropolis, Paranorman finds a conclusion but no resolution in its simmering of the mass hysteria. As the townsfolk recount the hectic night, the responsibility rests with the anger of the mob rather than the supposed scourge they raged against. In this way, it would seem like Paranorman understands people a bit more than Metropolis, perhaps suggesting that Krakauer's point that great love might force tyranny in retreat is wrong, and the discourse enabled by the fantastic is circumstantial. Thomas Elsässer noted on the debate about German Expressionism that no single stylistic label could hope to cover the many innovative ideas about film decor, the distinctive mise-en-scène of light and shadow, or the technical advances in cinematography usually attributed to Weimar filmmakers. And yet, in retrospect, a unity imposed itself on the films, their subjects, and stories. It seems like, starting with The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, the films usually indexed as Weimar cinema have one thing in common. They are invariably constructed as picture puzzles. Consistently, if not systematically, they refuse to be tied down to a single meaning. The same can be said about stop-motion animated films. There is no single stylistic label to connect the two films by Wes Anderson, Tim Burton's output, or even Jason and the Argonauts or the Pied Piper. Even with Laika, there is a distinction between the works discussed in this essay and their most recent output, Kubo and the Two Strings, a film much more in conversation with Japanese folklore than the more European settings and narratives of the three films in the essay. Both German Expressionism and Laika's stop-motion animated films are more than just what Elsässer calls innovative ideas in film decor or the distinctive mise-en-scène, but are a collection of works in communication with much larger ideas, with the key to appreciating both being the ability to recognize this incongruence with their technical traits. As Lottie Eisner said, the expressionist does not see, he has visions. Wilhelm Wöhringer had a similar thought, saying, abstraction stems from the great anxiety which man experiences when terrorized by the phenomena he perceives around him, the relationship and mysterious polarities of which he is unable to decipher. This primordial anguish which man feels when confronted with unlimited space makes him want to detach the objects of the exterior world from their natural context, or better still, to free the individual object from its tics with other objects to make it absolute. Almost speaking into the future about animation, the student of Prague in the Golem How He Came Into the World director Paul Wegener spoke about this absolute in a 1916 speech, saying, "You've all seen films in which a line appears, then curves and changes. This line gives birth to faces, then disappears. Nobody has ever thought of attempting an experiment of this order in a full-length film. I can imagine a kind of cinema which would use nothing but moving surfaces, against which there would impinge events that would still participate in the natural world, but transcend the lines and volume of the natural." As Esther Leslie puts it, animation is not a depiction of a recognizable world. The mission of animation is often to tarry with the shadow side, the night side of nature, that obscured realm in which all unexplained and magical illogical events occur. Much like the films of the Expressionist movement, we're taking reality and subverting it with ethereal shapes, lines, and narratives. Animation approaches issues with a slanted idea. As Leslie continues, animation evokes history, plays with it, undermines it, subverts it, but it does not have it, just as it does not have nature. It has different nature, it has different history. Consequently, the medium is allowed to speak more thoroughly and impactful than a reality-based piece of narrative. Leslie calls animation the possibility of possibility, and with both stop-motion and expressionism, this possibility is realized in the absolute sense that Wegener spoke of, transcending the lines and volume of the natural, yet still participating in the natural world.